On September 1, 1939, the German Wehrmacht crossed the Polish border. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. The world expected a replay of World War I, static trenches and slow grinding attrition. Instead, they witnessed a revolution in warfare. The Germans unleashed Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. It was a coordinated ballet of destruction. Dive bombers screamed from the sky to disrupt communications. Tanks punched through enemy lines, and mechanized infantry flooded the gaps. Poland fell in weeks. After a quiet winter, the phony war ended in the spring of 1940 with shattering violence. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, then turned its gaze to the west. In just 6 weeks, the German army did what they failed to do in 4 years of the First World War. They bypassed the Maginot Line, crushed the Dutch and Belgians, and humiliated the French army, considered one of the best in Europe. British troops barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. On June 22, 1940, France surrendered. Hitler insisted the armistice be signed in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. It was the peak of his power. The swastika flew over Paris. Italy, seeing the way the wind was blowing, formally entered the war, hoping to grab territory in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Now only Britain stood alone against the Axis in Europe. But the Axis was not a unified command. Unlike the Allies, who eventually shared intelligence and strategy, Germany, Italy, and Japan fought separate wars. In September 1940, Japan, Germany, and Italy signed the Tripartite Pact, formally creating the Axis military alliance. They warned the United States to stay out of the conflict, but while the diplomats shook hands, the strategic cracks were already forming. Germany was preparing to break its pact with the Soviets, while Japan was looking south toward the resource-rich colonies of the Europeans. Chapter 5: Hubris and Overextension. 1941 was the year the Axis powers sealed their fate through the sheer scale of their ambition. Hitler, obsessed with the destruction of Jewish Bolshevism and the acquisition of oil and grain, launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22. It was the largest invasion in the history of warfare. 3 million Axis troops tore into the Soviet Union. Initially, it was another masterclass in destruction. The Red Army collapsed. German panzers raced across the steppes, encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops at a time. They reached the gates of Moscow. But they had underestimated 2 things: the endless reserves of Soviet manpower and the Russian winter. As the temperature dropped to 40 below zero, the German machinery froze. The Lightning War ground to a halt in the ice. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan was running out of time. The United States, opposing Japan's brutal expansion in China, had imposed an oil embargo. Japan had a choice: withdraw from China and lose face, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. But to do that, they had to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet. On December 7, 1941, Japan gambled everything on a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. It was a tactical masterpiece and a strategic catastrophe. Japan hoped to demoralize the Americans into a negotiated peace. Instead, they awoken a sleeping giant. The United States entered the war with its massive industrial capacity untouched. Within days, Hitler, in a fit of solidarity and hubris, declared war on the United States. Now the Axis powers were at war with the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States simultaneously. They had united the world's greatest naval power, the world's greatest land power, and the world's greatest industrial power against them. Chapter 6: The High Watermark. For the first half of 1942, the Axis seemed unstoppable. Japan swept through Southeast Asia, capturing Singapore, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. They claimed to be liberating Asia from Western colonialism, creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But in reality, they were replacing one master with a far more brutal one. In North Africa, the German general Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was driving the British back towards the Suez Canal. In Russia, the German army launched a new summer offensive, aiming for the oil fields of the Caucasus and a city on the Volga River named after the Soviet leader, Stalingrad. This was the high watermark. The Axis controlled a vast percentage of the globe, but their economies were not built for a long war. They relied on quick looting of resources. They lacked the manufacturing depth of the Allies, and they were beginning to suffer from the resistance of occupied peoples. From the French resistance to the partisans in the forests of Belarus, the new order was being bled by 1,000 cuts. The Holocaust, the systematic state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, was accelerating. It diverted trains, soldiers, and resources away from the war effort to feed the machinery of death, a grotesque priority that showcased the moral and strategic bankruptcy of the Nazi regime. Chapter 7. The Tide Turns.
The history of the 20th century is often remembered as a story of two great wars. But in reality, it was one long catastrophe, separated by a 20-year truce. A silence that was less a peace and more a holding of breath. To understand the greatest conflict in human history, we cannot simply look at the explosions of 1939. We must look at the silences that preceded them. We must look at the resentment, the economic ruin, and the blinding ambition that gave birth to the Axis powers. This is not just the story of Germany, Italy, and Japan. It is the story of a terrifying idea that the world could be carved up by the strong, and that the weak existed only to be conquered. It is the story of a rapid, meteoric rise, fueled by vengeance and modern industry, and a fall that would leave the world in ashes. This is the detailed history of the Axis powers. Chapter 1. The Ashes of Versailles. The seeds of the Axis alliance were sown in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles in 1919. The First World War had ended, and the victors, Britain, France, and America, dictated the terms. For Germany, the Treaty of Versailles was not a peace treaty, it was a death sentence. Stripped of its colonies, its military dismantled, and burdened with crushing economic reparations, Germany was humiliated. The German people, told for years that victory was imminent, felt they had been stabbed in the back not by the enemy on the battlefield, but by politicians at home. Meanwhile, further south, Italy sat on the winning side of the table, yet felt equally defeated. Despite losing over 600,000 men in the war, Italy was denied the territorial gains it had been promised. They called it the mutilated victory. Italian society began to fracture. Strikes paralyzed the industry, and veterans returned home to a country that seemed to have no use for them. And, on the other side of the world, Japan was emerging as a modern, industrialized power. They too sat with the victors, yet they were treated with thinly veiled racism by the Western powers, denied the respect they felt their modernization earned them. In these three nations, different forms of resentment were boiling, but they all pointed toward the same conclusion. The current world order, dominated by the British and French empires, was rigged. If they wanted to survive, they couldn't play by the rules. They would have to rewrite them. Chapter 2. The March of the Dictators. The first domino fell in Italy. In the chaos of the early 1920s, a former socialist journalist named Benito Mussolini founded a new movement. He called it fascism, named after the fasces, a bundle of rods with an axe, an ancient Roman symbol of authority. Mussolini's message was intoxicatingly simple. Democracy was weak and inefficient. What Italy needed was strength, unity, and a return to the glory of the Roman Empire. By 1922, Mussolini had marched on Rome. By 1925, he was the dictator of Italy, the Il Duce. He militarized the society, drained the marshes, and made the trains run on time, trading liberty for order. The world watched with a mix of horror and admiration. In Germany, a decorated World War I veteran was watching Mussolini closely. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, attempted their own coup in 1923, which failed miserably. But while in prison, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, laying out a blueprint that went far beyond Mussolini's fascism. Hitler's ideology was biologically driven. He believed in a racial hierarchy with the Aryan race at the top, and he believed that Germany needed Lebensraum, or living space, in the East. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the global economy collapsed. In Germany, the moderate government crumbled under the weight of hyperinflation and unemployment. Desperate people turned to the man who promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor. Within months, German democracy was dead. While Europe descended into dictatorship, Japan was undergoing a subtler but equally dangerous transformation. There was no single charismatic dictator in Tokyo. Instead, the military gradually hijacked the government. Driven by a lack of natural resources, the Japanese Imperial Army believed their nation's survival depended on dominating the Asian mainland. In 1931, acting without orders from the government, the Japanese army invaded Manchuria. The League of Nations condemned the act, but did nothing. Japan simply walked out of the League. The message was clear. The international police were asleep. The road to conquest was open. Chapter 3. Forging the Iron Pact. By the mid-1930s, the Axis powers began to gravitate toward one another. They were united not by friendship, but by common enemies. Communism, represented by the Soviet Union, and liberal democracy, represented by Britain and France. In 1936, Hitler and Mussolini formalized their relationship with the Rome-Berlin axis. Mussolini famously declared that the history of Europe would now revolve around this axis. That same year, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, a mutual defense agreement against the Soviet Union. Italy joined a year later. The alliance was solidified in blood during the Spanish Civil War. Hitler and Mussolini sent troops and planes to support the fascist rebellion of Francisco Franco, using the conflict as a testing ground for their new war machines. The world saw the devastation of Guernica, a preview of the terror bombing that was to come. Emboldened by the lack of resistance, Hitler began to move. He annexed Austria in 1938, the Anschluss, to cheering crowds. Next, he demanded the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. Desperate to avoid another war, Britain and France capitulated at the Munich Conference, handing Hitler what he wanted in exchange for a promise of peace. It was the height of appeasement. Hitler signed the paper, but privately, he was furious. He didn't want peace. He wanted a war to prove German dominance. In 1939, the final piece of the diplomatic puzzle fell into place with the Pact of Steel between Germany and Italy, a formal military alliance. But the true shock came in August 1939, when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. It was a cynical move. It freed Hitler from the fear of a two-front war. The board was set. The pieces were moving.
The turning point did not happen in a single day, but over a series of pivotal months between late 1942 and 1943. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy intercepted Japanese codes and ambushed their fleet at the Battle of Midway. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, the heart of their offensive power. They could not replace them. The U.S. could. From that moment on, Japan was fighting a defensive war. In North Africa, the British stopped Rommel at El Alamein, pushing the Axis forces back and eventually out of Africa entirely. This exposed the soft underbelly of Europe. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. The Italian people, exhausted and disillusioned, turned on Mussolini. The fascist Grand Council voted him out of power, and he was arrested. Italy surrendered, though Germany quickly invaded from the north to keep the war going on the Italian peninsula. The Berlin-Rome axis had snapped. But the true breaker of the German army was Stalingrad. For 5 months, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army fought a brutal, close-quarters battle in the ruins of the city. It was a rat's war, fought room by room, sewer by sewer. Hitler refused to allow a retreat. In February 1943, the German Sixth Army, starving and frozen, surrendered. It was the first time a German field marshal had ever been captured. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Chapter 8. The fortress crumbles. By 1944, the Axis powers were being crushed by the sheer weight of Allied material superiority. The Allies controlled the air and the sea. German cities were being reduced to rubble by day and night bombing campaigns. Japan's merchant fleet was decimated by American submarines, cutting off the raw materials they desperately needed. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Western Allies opened the long-awaited Second Front with the invasion of Normandy. Despite fierce German resistance, the beachhead held. France was liberated. Squeezed from the east by the Soviet juggernaut and from the west by the Americans and British, the Third Reich was collapsing. In the Pacific, the US adopted an island-hopping strategy, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions to capture strategic airfields closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. The fighting was ferocious. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese soldiers fought to the death, adhering to a code that viewed surrender as the ultimate shame. Kamikaze pilots hurled their planes into American ships in a desperate attempt to halt the advance. In Europe, Hitler survived an assassination attempt by his own officers in July 1944, growing increasingly paranoid and delusional. He moved imaginary armies on maps in his bunker, while the Soviets crossed the German border. Chapter 9. The Fall. The end of the Axis was a descent into total ruin. By the spring of 1945, the Soviet army had encircled Berlin. The Battle of Berlin was the final slaughter, involving millions of soldiers. On April 30th, 1945, with the Red Army just blocks away, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. 2 days earlier, Benito Mussolini had been captured by Italian partisans while trying to flee to Switzerland. He was executed, and his body was hung upside down in a square in Milan. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted 12 years and destroyed much of Europe in the process. But in the Pacific, the war raged on. Japan was being firebombed, Tokyo was burned to the ground. Yet the Japanese military government refused to surrender, preparing the civilian population to fight off an invasion with sharpened bamboo spears. The Allies feared that an invasion of Japan would cost 1 million American lives. The United States deployed a terrifying new weapon. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second fell on Nagasaki. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, shattering the Japanese army in China. Caught between nuclear annihilation and a Soviet invasion, Emperor Hirohito broke the deadlock. On August 15, 1945, his voice was broadcast on the radio for the first time, announcing the surrender. Conclusion: The Long Shadow. The fall of the Axis powers reshaped the globe. It marked the end of the age of old European empires and the rise of the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, setting the stage for the Cold War. The Axis alliance was a failure of historic proportions. It was an alliance built on mutual suspicion rather than shared values, driven by an ideology of hate that ultimately turned the rest of humanity against it. They had bet that the democracies were too soft to fight, and that the sheer brutality of fascism could reshape reality. Their ambition was staggering. Over 70 million people lay dead, the majority of them civilians. The Holocaust, the rape of Nanking, the starvation of prisoners, these crimes revealed the darkest depths of human nature. The story of the Axis is a warning. It demonstrates how quickly civilized nations can descend into barbarism when fueled by grievance, nationalism, and the allure of the strongman. They had massive armaments, but it was nothing compared to human resilience. The Axis rose like a firestorm, consuming everything in its path, but in the end, it left behind only ashes and a lesson the world never wanted to forget. Parenthesis, end parenthesis.